Joining us now, public intellectual, activist, philosopher, and now two-time guest on Bad Faith, Dr. Cornel West. Welcome.
I tell you, I'm blessed each time you all are kind enough to invite me in, Brother Virgil, Sister Briahna, and Brother Ben. Won't forget about Brother Ben doing his thing.
Well, it truly is our honor. There's nothing that ever happens that wouldn't be good to get your take about, but where we wouldn't relish your insight and opinion on stuff. But particularly given that you've been at the center of one of these ongoing, you could call it a cancel culture issue. You could call it all kinds of things. You could call it censorship. But Harvard denying you tenure was, a story that was percolating a little while ago, a few weeks ago. There certainly was some consternation. The Black Law Students Association wrote a really compelling letter on your behalf. I watched your interview on Democracy Now! And now we are talking about this again as Nikole Hannah-Jones has been denied tenure at UNC. And I'm curious whether you see any parallels there, or do you think certain different things are happening in those instances?
Well, I do think that there's an increasing sense of censorship among a number of persons with particular viewpoints. I think in the case of Sister Nikole, and I had signed a petition that Brother Coates and the others had put forward, because I do think she's a high quality journalist. I think she has much to say. And the 1619 Project is a very, very important project. It tells some very important truths. I don't think that any one interpretation fully grasps the rich history of any empire, but her perspective and that of her colleagues, it seems to me to be crucial and fundamental, and that's why I supported her. But in my case, I think it had more to do with the Palestinian cause. And there you got Brother Salater, you got Brother Norman, you got Mark Lamont Hill, Professor Hill, Brother Mark. There's so many other persons who have had much more devastating situations than mine in regard to this relatively taboo issue. But I think we've got to be very vigilant and consistent with a sense of integrity in terms of our defense of folk who are being, quote unquote, canceled. I mean, even some of the folk who were leading the charge in support of Sister Nikole, Brother Coates and the others, that I applaud them for what they're doing, but they don't say a mumbling word about professors who get done in because of their commitment to the Palestinian cause, or just to cause of truth and justice in the Middle East. It's not just the Palestinian cause. We're concerned about Jewish Israeli brothers and sisters too, but we want fairness, we want peace, and we want justice. So that what happens is you get a selective support of certain kinds of rights and liberties, certain kinds of individuals and persons, and it's not consistent across the board. And that's understandable, but it just needs to be called out. We have to tell the truth about it.
Yeah, that certainly was my impression. I mean, I was reading some of the articles about Nikole Hannah-Jones and noting how many of them were, and wondering, if it's a little bit that the media has relationships with other media figures and is kind of circling around its own just because of its familiarity and proximity, and trying to figure out what was going on, because especially now with all that's going on in Palestine, it seems particularly striking that the uproar in defense of Nikole Hannah-Jones seems to be much more significant, pronounced, compared to what happened to you, when I would argue, I mean, there were some arguments that are being made about why Nikole Hannah-Jones was denied tenure, and it's all very opaque. This process is all very opaque, but there are some substantive critiques of her work. Whereas in your case, there doesn't seem to be anything that anybody's pointing to, and your record of scholarship and your status of public influence as one of America's only remaining true public intellectuals is really undeniable.
No, yeah, I think one is I'm just so much older, probably a bit more decrepit than Sister Nikole. She's young and vital and vibrant. I got certain kind of vitality too, though, but I've got a longer record. And so what happens is that she has a number of friends in neoliberal circles that are both Black and white and brown and otherwise. And therefore, when she's attacked, they respond. And I agree with the response. I think that she, as I said before, I think she's high quality in terms of the kind of work that she does. I mean, she's not Eric Foner and Nell Painter. You know what I mean? Those are towering American historians. She is a superb journalist who does serious historical work, but she's still a journalist. She's in a school of journalism. The two persons who had the position before her, they were tenured. They come nowhere near her quality. And so I support her wholeheartedly, both in terms of the project and as well as the particular position. But when it comes in my case, I mean, good God, after 45 years of teaching, tenured at Yale, 1984, university professor in 2 different places, honorary degree from University of Paris, the Gifford Lecture in 3 years, which is a Nobel Prize equivalent in philosophy. We can go on in this regard, So that it's a joke in my case. It really is. It's just a joke. It's like Ben Webster, being told he got to go back to high school to learn his scales, and he's playing some of the most beautiful melodies that we know on the saxophone. Ben just look at that and say, "Y'all sick. You pathological. I got work to do." What else my attitude toward Harvard? Harvard's just sick. It's got spiritual bankruptcy. I got work to do.
Well, the Harvard piece of this, there's some irony there, right? Because so the Nikole Hannah-Jones piece is all about this kind of vilification of critical race theory, which I would argue the 1619 Project doesn't even really bear any significant relation to what critical race theory is, in fact, a kind of scholarship that came out of critical legal theory and is associated with a legal tradition, and which has become pretty attenuated from what the Republicans have been calling critical race theory, which is anytime anybody talks about race and we don't like that, race bad, race not real, blah, blah, blah. But
anyone who's critical is just critical race theory.
If you're critical and a race, yeah.
Yes.
But the irony is that Harvard really was ground zero in a lot of ways for these critical race studies with Derek Bell, who was in fact one of the most significant figures to have been the victim of what I would call a substantial and real cancellation when he, ended up quitting, you could say, being forced to leave campus after there were protests and student walkouts and agitation to try to get the faculty to hire its first woman of color, which it didn't do for many years. In the middle of all this, ironically enough, they hired Elizabeth Warren, and the Harvard Crimson wrote her up at one point as the first woman of color hire on campus. And it wasn't until years later that Lonnie Guinier, I believe, was ultimately hired as the genuine first woman of color on campus. And so to have these weird parallels, where Harvard could arguably be legitimately criticized for shunning the father of critical race theory in a lot of ways, but that conversation being completely missed, focusing on Nikole Hannah-Jones, who isn't really doing the critical race theory, and then ignoring Harvard and its pattern of actually participating in this political erasure through you, is really, as an observer, frustrating.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, I actually have the volume there. As you know, I was blessed to write the foreword to the critical race theory volume with Sister Kimberly Crenshaw and so many others, Brother Kendall at Columbia and others. And I do think you're right. I think that there was a moment in the history of Harvard law where with Berto Unger and Duncan Kennedy and the others in critical legal studies and then critical race studies opened up a critique of empire and predatory capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy in some very, very creative ways. And yet the backlash has been so intense in the last number of years at Harvard. Harvard has gone backward in a significant way when it comes to serious consideration of any perspective that highlights the doings and sufferings of Black people. I mean, what's similar about critical race theory and what Sister Nikole is doing is she does look at American history through the doings and sufferings of Black people. That doesn't make her a critical race theorist. It just means that white supremacy is going to have a whole lot of weight and gravity in her understanding of how American history developed over time and space. And that's an important set of lenses. It's just that for me, as you know, and I've learned so much from yourself in this regard, that the role of class and predatory capitalism and empire has to always be stressed in any discourse about race and white supremacy, or you're going to end up with very much what you have now, supporting Sister Nikole, which is it's led by Brother Coates and Cobb and the others who are part of the neoliberal hegemony of the Black bourgeoisie. They're the public face of it. You see, that's why Coates can write in his last book, I can't say a word about Israel because I don't know anything about it. That sounds like Clyburn just a few days ago, right? I don't know anything about foreign policy. I can't say a word. But you've been voting on foreign policy ever since you've been in Congress, man. You're just scared. You're just intimidated. You don't want to come to terms with the truth about Palestinian suffering vis-a-vis a vicious Israeli domination and occupation. Won't just come on out and say it. Coates, Cobb, all of y'all. You're just scared. You're running scared. You're tied to magazines which themselves have been supporting Israeli crimes against Palestinians.
Yeah, The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, if I recall correctly, was one of the biggest cheerleaders for the Iraq War.
After Iraq and the 2014 with the downright crimes against humanity when it comes to precious Palestinians, be they children or women or men and so forth. And these are issues of moral and spiritual weight. It has nothing to do with anti-Jewish hatred, or anti-Palestinian hatred, or anti-white hatred, or anything. We're talking about domination, occupation, subjugation, and we're talking about death.
Yeah. And
disproportionate amounts of death among innocent people. The death of any innocent person, Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever, is a crime against humanity. But you can imagine what it's like when it's 555 in 50 days a number of years ago. And what is it now? The average is six children every day. I mean, how can anybody remain silent other than folk who are scared and intimidated? And that's been characteristic of too many of our Black intellectuals when it comes to issues of Palestine.
It's hard, right? Because I feel like I have, since I started writing, since I guess became a journalist just a few years ago, I feel like I immediately entered into all of these conflicts with these exact figures, right? I have gone back and forth with Nikole Hannah-Jones at length on Twitter about what I perceive to be an absence of a class analysis in some of her work, even though I initially followed her because I do value a lot of her work around school segregation in New York. That is why she was known to me and why I began to engage. Same with Ta-Nehisi Coates. And the conflict became such that I ironically became part of the story about why he actually left Twitter. I later found out, I heard him speak on a panel saying that it was a tweet that suggested that he wasn't engaging in Black women's argument, and I was one of the Black women listed and was only engaging with men that finally chased him off Twitter. So I feel like in many ways, as I've been trying to make a point about working class coalitions, about progressive politics, the people who I end up butting heads with, perhaps because they're the first line of defense when it comes to these kinds of issues for the broader neoliberal class, are these Black figureheads in these prominent media positions who serve the role of kind of, whether or not they intend to, gatekeeping Black public opinion in a way that has been very effective, and whether or not they intend to, and from my perspective, end up covering for and making providing insulation for things like the Joe Biden campaign, the Joe Biden administration and his long record of, frankly, anti-Blackness, which was never opined upon by anybody in this cohort.
That is absolutely right. I mean, that's why, we've got to always begin an analysis of the head of any empire. In this case, is Biden and Harris. That Biden's got blood on his hands with mass incarceration, invasion, occupation of Iraq, the unleashing of Wall Street greed with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and, this vicious Israeli domination and occupation of precious Palestinians. He has been not just behind them, he's bragged about being behind all four of those. And all four crimes against humanity. We ought to be very clear about that. You talk about the levels of grotesque wealth inequality when you talk about what has happened in mass incarceration. I've taught in prison for 41 years. I've seen the expansion, the shift, and the ugly intensity of targeting vulnerable Black brothers. And we have to just be candid about it. We have to say it in such a way that people don't think that somehow, we are obsessed with Jewish wrongdoing. No, we're concerned with wrongdoing no matter who it is. And if it were the Palestinian occupation of Jews, we are in solidarity with Jewish brothers and sisters. It's a matter of what these structural inequalities and injustices are. And it's a matter of being honest and candid about it. And unfortunately, it's just so difficult, my dear sister, to have an honest and candid conversation about the suffering of Palestinians within the U.S. intelligentsia. You have just so much misunderstanding. You have so many interests being put forward, so many frameworks truncated, and most people concerned about their careers and their status and their position.
Well, why do you suppose that is, Dr. West? Because in the past few years, we've seen in a variety of openings to the left in what is acceptable public discourse. And, we can talk about whether or not, the changing of liberal discourse actually is causing any kind of consequential effect on policy attitudes towards towards socialism, for instance, towards defunding the police and so on and so forth. But why is it that Israel remains a third rail?
I mean, one is that 2,000 years of some of the most vicious treatment in the history of the species, and this has been the case for our precious Jewish brothers and sisters, does bring with it a certain kind of moral authority, because one has been victimized. There's just no doubt about that. The challenge is, how do you understand 2,000 years of, for the most part, being viciously treated as underdogs, and then after 1948, with the ethnic cleansing, with 700,000 Arabs pushed out, many at gunpoint, and then the connection of that Israeli nation state, and it behaves like any other nation state, just like the Liberian nation state, the Ethiopian nation state, the U.S. nation state, monopoly on instrumentalities of violence, concern with our alliances with other nation states, and Israel has a direct connection with the American empire. So that all of a sudden now, you've got a top dog status vis-a-vis precious Palestinians, but you've got underdog history in terms of Jews in the world, and especially in the Western and Middle Eastern world. And so it does pose a challenge. Now, a lot of people want to say, especially liberals and neoliberals, well, y'all don't understand how complicated it is. It's just so complicated. You can't really take a stand because it's so complicated. I don't study this stuff. It's just too complicated. I say, get off the crack pipe. You know it ain't that complicated. There's an occupied and an occupier. And yes, there's a complication when the occupier has been subjugated for 2,000 years. Indeed, because we're concerned about the truth. And the condition of truth was to allow suffering to speak. In the Middle Ages, that suffering was Jewish suffering in Europe. It's Black suffering under slavery. It's women suffering across the board. It's working people suffering in any capitalist a society. It's the suffering of human beings. But to make that move toward a humanism, the kind of thing that Edward Said was trying to make, and Rabbi Heschel was trying to make, and Dorothy Day has been trying to make. Now, we've got Judith Butler. We've got Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart has been an exemplary case. I remember him with the New Republic, with Leon Wieser and Martin Parrish. He was supporting Israeli apartheid conditions on the West Bank. He changed his mind. He's a critically engaged intellectual and thinker, and an Orthodox Jewish brother who was trying to rethink his assumptions in light of his ideals and values. It gets him in a lot of trouble, but he's honest in this regard. And I think the beautiful thing is there is a major wave of young folk and many young Jewish brothers and sisters who say, we have been lied to. Our parents lied to us. It wasn't a land with no people. You lied to us. It is apartheid-like conditions on the West Bank. You lied to us. Yes, we have democracy, and that democracy is very precious within Israel, but the Palestinians are still second-class citizens. It's still a class-ridden society. Jews can't marry non-Jews. If Rosenberg falls in love with Jamal Jackson, they can't get married. How come? Because you got religious authority. I mean, these are the realities that folk have to come to terms with. And a lot of the young Jewish brothers and sisters who were at camp so-and-so in the summertime, they didn't get those truths. And when it finally hit them, they said, my God, these folk been lying to us. Well, we had black people undergoing the same thing with Obama. He's our Malcolm X. He's our Martin Luther King Jr. He's our Fannie Lou Hamer. Wait a minute. Somebody was lying to us. He's dropping drones on innocent people. He's militarizing the police department. He's siding with Wall Street. He got Snowden and the others under surveillance. How come y'all lied to us? Well, that's what it is to engage in critical reflection, critical engagement in this sense, you see. Lies go hand in hand with crimes, and liars come in all colors. Criminals come in all colors, all genders, all sexual orientation, all national identity. And more people are coming to that reality when it comes to the Palestinian cause. And again, in the case of Nikole, concerned about black folk, all of us concerned about black folk. Yes, but you got some class dimensions that you must come to terms with. Gender dimensions, absolutely, but not just the gender. The class ones becomes very important. And we are experiencing more and more the outright duplicity and complicity of the decadent elements of the black middle class and the black bourgeoisie that will say anything to hide and conceal the lies and crimes here in this country and in the Middle East and other parts of the world.
When you were talking about the reality that the oppressed can become the oppressor, that yes. Obama can step in the shoes of everything that has always been wrong about American empire and deserves criticism regardless of what race he is. And That's it right. makes me reflect on the kind of essentialism that I think is frustrating. If there is a legitimate critique of work, not just Nikole Hannah-Jones, but a certain genre of race writing, I would potentially put Ta-Nehisi Coates in this category. It is a kind of racial essentialism, for lack of a better word, that resists that separation, that decoupling of identity and kind of value or worth, or whether you're the good guy or the bad guy. And it's not, if you were to ask any of these people rationally, can the black person be bad? They would say, of course, obviously these are intelligent thinking people. But when you read much of their writing, I think and I don't want to agree with some of the most bad faith criticism about these folks, which says, they're just doing racism from the other direction. But I do think there is a way that these figures can talk about race that does a kind of racecraft, to quote the Field Sisters, that creates a reality and that feels really fixed, a racial reality that seems really fixed and immutable, and that doesn't allow for any diversity of essence within groups, that sees something through such a singularly racialized lens that it is inevitable that some portion of a white audience is going to feel like they're being told, you are white, there is this thing called whiteness, you can never escape it, and whiteness means that you are bad and part of the problem. And that not part of a system and benefiting from a system that is a problem, but kind of intrinsically problematic in your essence. And while there's a lot of kind of knee-jerk white response to this kind of thing that I think comes from people not willing to be critical, not willing to be analytical in the least, there is a part of it that gives me pause. Because I think that you can talk about the reality of America's racial legacy, and you can talk about the benefits, the wages of whiteness, as it were, without engaging in that particular essentialist project, which I think leads people to have these black and white views like the oppressed is always the oppressed and can never be the oppressor, and causes confusion around issues like, can we criticize Clyburn? Can we criticize Obama? Can we criticize the Israeli government?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of the problem or challenge, you all tell me what you think here, is that the tremendous gravity of white supremacy in its various forms and iterations over time make it easy for those who have an ahistorical conception of race, or those who would fetishize white supremacy as if it's not rooted in and deeply connected to imperial expansion, predatory capitalism, and so forth, you see. So that I think you're right that Brother Coates and Brother Cobb and the others, they're not racist. I mean, they're closest partners in terms of professional ties are white folk and Jewish folk. I mean, there is no Coates on the public stage without Atlantic Magazine, which is deeply pro-Israeli apartheid. You see, and the same would be true for Jelani. Jelani doesn't surface publicly until he hits the New Yorker. Now, Remnant's of a different kind of brother. Remnant's a little bit more critical of the occupation, but he's still somebody who doesn't hit it head on in the New Yorker in the way in which one would like, you see. So that, and there's nothing wrong with that, because all of us have different white and Jewish partners and friends and so forth and so on, because in the end, we're like Frantz Fanon, we're humanists. Frantz Fanon was calling for the confrontation with European crimes and African crimes. And Eurocentric frameworks were disenabling us to come to terms with both crimes. But if all we end up with is neoliberal politics that allow us to weaponize race in such a way that it helps our individual careers, they make big money, they gain access to unbelievable positions and so on, and can't say a mumbling word about Palestinian lives mattering and act like Black Lives Matter makes you Malcolm X come back from the grave. You say, no, we're not putting up with this. We come from a great people. The Cold War Black liberals did the same thing to Du Bois. They did the same thing to Paul Robeson. They did the same thing to Claudia Jones. They didn't say a mumbling word about the Smith Act when Claudia Jones was deported to London. They didn't say a mumbling word about Benjamin Davis, Harvard Law School graduate, right? 1921, city councilman from Harlem, member of the Communist Party, when he dragged to jail in Ohio. They didn't say a mumbling word about that in the name of liberty. What was the Black middle class doing? Well, we're trying to gain access to American citizenship, and we can't alienate the folk who are running things, including those who are heading the U.S. empire. And we must not commit that same massive, blind move that was done by the Cold War Black liberals. And that is being done these days by these Black neoliberals. And they claim we're not neoliberals at all. Not at all. That's a category that doesn't apply to us.
Sounds like what a neoliberal would say.
The proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like there's something opening up, and this could be premature, but the sense of solidarity that so many Black Americans have and have always had with Palestine seems to be putting some tension on the ability for that neoliberal journalist class and political class to pretend that it is as representative as it once could. And I see this tension bubbling up in the comment sections of videos, in the comment section of the Shade Room. I hear it coming out in clubhouse talks where people are asking, is the Democratic Party really there for Black people, and really coming through for the necks of Black media figures and demanding why they haven't held Joe Biden more accountable, demanding why they didn't have more to say about the options presented when we were in the Democratic primary and there were still choices, demanding to know why Black Lives Matter and other groups haven't exercised more leverage, or why everyone said line up and vote for Biden and we'll talk about it afterward. I see these questions being asked organically by people who aren't part of like the Bernie left or any kind of traditional left as we've come to understand it over the past years. But regular schmegular Black people who are being radicalized by their affinity for movements like the movement for civil rights for Palestinians. And I wonder if you've observed any of that, or if you have any insight into how to empower those people, because I see it burbling, but at the end of the day, there's so few openings in the mainstream media to allow that fire to vent, that heat to vent and come to the surface.
Well, I think one, the mainstream media will continually get enough rope to hang itself as its credibility and legitimacy is radically called into question. There's no way that you can have such massive crimes against humanity and mainstream media, be it CNN or MSNBC, hardly even have reports on it. And when they do report it, it's only Hamas rockets going in rather than occupation and domination, rather than the disproportionate number of civilians who were killed and so forth. That sooner or later, those chickens will come home to roost for the neoliberal corporate media. They can only hold on for so long. The veil is being stripped, as it were. And we are experiencing a real paradigm shift in terms of the spillover into the mainstream. There's no doubt about that. And then, when you have Brother Biden and Sister Harris talking about, America's not a racist country. Everybody say, oh my God, here we go again. More PR strategies here. They can't even talk about how deep white supremacy is in the nation that they are running. Oh, it's just pockets of racism. Come on, Clive. What are you talking? These are catastrophes that are occurring institutionally and personally. So when people see that reluctance, and then you see the Black political class, nothing but a echo of Biden. If Biden had said America is a racist country, Harris would have said America is a racist country. Clyburn would have said America is a racist country, which means what they're saying has nothing to do with truth, nothing to do with integrity. They're simply echoing the head man. And people can see quite clearly, my God, you have no courage to tell the truth at all. You'll say anything in order to fall in line. And once that becomes more and more apparent, then we're going to have a more protracted crisis among the Black political class, the Black intelligentsia, and the Black artists, because the artists play a very important role here. Oh, Lord, I wish Prince was alive. He got the new album coming out, Welcome to America. Well, he and I were in dialogue. I said, Prince, you're a genius, but you ain't no Curtis Mayfield. So he went back in the studio and said, I'm going to make me a Curtis Mayfield album. And I'm telling you, he came out smoking. And we need more Black artists out here telling the truth, but in love. Again, and this is, love is very important because we loving the people. We loving everyday people. They're the ones who are suffering. I don't care what color they are.
But Dr. West, look what has happened to the artists. Already, there have been a number of celebrities of various kinds. The Hadid sisters, who are Palestinian, Mark Ruffalo, Dua Lipa, who have come out in defense of Palestine, in support of Palestine. And already it feels like that little window where people had to say it's okay to say Palestinian lives matter is shutting. And you have Mark Ruffalo trending #1 on Twitter today because he basically issued a retraction for describing what's going on as, did he call it genocide? Use the word genocide? Was that the word that he had to retract, where he felt that he had to retract? And these are people who, in the grand scheme of things, are relatively independent, right? We just had Susan Sarandon on the show talking about the way that the academy, she was basically kicked out of the academy for a period of time for advocating for the rights of people with HIV/AIDS, right? And even people who are already rich and already famous, like Susan Sarandon and Mark Ruffalo, feel enough pressure. Everyone cares about their careers, no matter how much you've achieved. They feel this pressure. Not that Susan Sarandon retracted anything, but Mark Ruffalo did. And we were talking about how you become a Susan Sarandon. Why do you choose to keep banging your head against the wall and suffering in this way when there is obviously an enormous amount of pressure? Or otherwise, I don't think Mark Ruffalo would have done what he did.
Yeah.
And then if that's true for them, what chance the normal people have who are reliant on podcast subscriptions or their column at The Atlantic, or who have a much more tenuous grasp on being able to support themselves in a capitalist economy? It
just means that shows like Bad Faith and Democracy Now! and other podcasts that are willing to tell the truth and stay in contact with the humanity and beauty of any of us who are suffering, be we Palestinian, Jewish, Ethiopian, Guatemalan, or what have you. We just have to be highly fortified, and we have to be committed to fight against that grain.
But Dr. West, look at what you're going through right now professionally, and you've fought some version of this fight for basically your entire career. What do you think makes you behave differently from a colleague who we may like, who's substantively a good person, who does good work, who shares your values, but just says, you know what, I'm not going to talk about Palestine. I'm not going to do the thing that's going to get me denied tenure.
Well, that's a whole lot of folk. That's a whole lot of Black folk.
Yes, it's the majority of everybody, you know?
No, it's true. It's true. Well, I was blessed to come from a mother and a father and a Shiloh Baptist Church and a Curtis Mayfield and a Aretha Franklin to say, I'm going to be a free Black man. Now, I'm a Jesus-loving free Black man, and Jesus-loving folk don't have necessarily a monopoly on this. But you could be secular, agnostic, Muslim, or what have you. When you decide to be free and you are committed to a truth and a beauty and a love of a quest for that truth and beauty and goodness, that, in 1979, Edward Said and I are having teach-ins on Palestine. We marching against the New York Times in 1982 with the Lebanon invasion because they won't use the word occupation. And it's been like that for some 40-some years. And it's going to be like that when they put me in the grave. That's just certain kind of way I decided to live my life. Now, I've been blessed to still be able to have a career. That career has been viciously attacked by Larry Summers in 2002, and now Harvard once again with the president and others, Brother McCall and the others. Well, we don't really know why we didn't have him go through tenure. We didn't get the right recommendation and blah, 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 blah. I said, oh, please, everybody knows what's going on. It's not a question of academic work. It's not a question of age. Something else. It's politics. And we have to be honest about that. And yet, I don't think I'm any better. It's just that I've just decided to be a certain way in the world that has something to do with consistency and integrity and a willingness not to completely succumb and accommodate myself to forces that I think actually are unworthy of any kind of accommodation.
Has anyone in the course of these conversations about tenure in Harvard, or in your career there generally or anywhere, how explicit has the pushback about Palestine been? What gives you the sense that it's not just political, but about that issue?
Well, one is that there were other professors who were turned down. We've had 3 professors turned down for tenure or acceptance at a tenure status owing to their very strong critiques of the Israeli domination and occupation, including a very, very highly talented Jewish Israeli sister. Because as you know, they got some very important voices in Israel that's been critical of this for a long, long time. And they're associated with Jewish Currents. I'm blessed to be on that advisory board with some magnificent Jewish brothers and sisters and others. And that's a matter of camaraderie, solidarity, and just moral and, for me, spiritual criteria that leads me to be blessed to work with them. And so I know that there's no other hypothesis that makes any sense other than the taboo issue of the Palestinian cause. I was the faculty advisor to the Palestinian students all the years I was here. We had major events with Black and Palestinian folk, with Mark Lamont Hill and the others there. And you get feedback and you get rumors and so forth of somehow, West is sowing division. I had a wonderful dialogue with my rabbi brother, Rabbi Jonah, who viciously attacked me initially, and said West is simply posing as some kind of divisive figure. He's fighting for his tenure. He's coordinating with the students in order to undermine any legitimacy of the state of Israel. I said, no, not at all. And then he wrote another piece and said that you probably saw it in the Crimson, West Shirk's discussion. I didn't even know he'd put out. He'd sent some emails that I never received. And so when I heard about it and I read in the Crimson, I gave him a call. We broke bread.
He's a debate me, bro.
We had a wonderful conversation for 2 hours. I said, I never received your emails. Let me tell you what my view is. I'll tell you what your view is. We sat down and had a meal. I started with a prayer with the brother. God be with two cracked vessels. This is going to be a bumpy night. We're going to have a serious conversation. You had to bring a little Betty Davis, We're going to have a serious conversation. And we did. And we had a wonderful conversation in that regard. And we ended up talking about our overlap and talking about where we agreed to disagree. But he was in a situation as head of Hillel where he's got tremendous pressure coming at him. And he had many Jewish students who were leaning in my direction, but also thinking I'd gone too far in my language and felt that they were being marginalized and mistreated by folk who were more critical of Israel. And therefore they were in a dilemma. And I'm thinking, no, people raise their voices and come down where you come down. I've always had good relations or friendships with a variety of people who I disagree with politically and ideologically. But we got to say what we mean and mean what we say and be open to countervailing positions and see what kind of insights they have and so forth and so on. But of course, what happened was I just got viewed as just anti-Semite across the board. I said, well, good God Almighty. If that's your only response to what I'm doing, that's pretty hollow. Because if Jewish brothers and sisters are in trouble, I'm hitting the streets for them. I got a history of that. You know what I mean? If Jewish students in trouble, I'm hitting the streets for them. I love those brothers and sisters. They know it. I know it. But that doesn't mean I don't love the Palestinian brothers and sisters in the same way.
There's something that feels weird. And Virgil and I were talking about this a little before we started this conversation. There's something that feels really interesting about talking about these issues and seeing the Biden administration come out so hard in defense of Israel, the nation. On the day that's the year anniversary of the George Floyd Act, George Floyd's passing, his murder, where Biden has missed the 1-year deadline he set for himself to pass the George Floyd Act. And when there hasn't been any other concrete delivery of anything substantive in the way of helping Black Americans, when he wouldn't be in office, but for Black Americans, and in particular, wouldn't have a Democratic Senate if not for the advocacy in Georgia that was foregrounded by various Black groups. And there is something that a pattern of comment that I've noticed in certain kind of discussions online that sometimes tips into a weird nativist, creepy place that's, where the minority groups are kind of butting heads against each other.
Right.
But that is a general sentiment that people are very frustrated that it feels like the U.S. government will defend anybody and everybody except for us, no matter how hard we work for the Democratic Party. And part of that is heartening to hear people get angry and to start to recognize that and to start to want to make more concrete demands. And part of it is frustrating because we saw what happened when a couple of people, artists, to your point, who are relatively independent, even older artists who's maybe not, but the peak of their career is probably a little behind them, Ice Cube, P. Diddy, saying the bare minimum, hey, Biden, give us something in exchange for our votes. And to see the Black intelligentsia, or the Black media class at least, really come down hard on those figures as kind of preposterous and presumptuous. And so I'm constantly curious about this question. I don't think it's one of those things where we have to convince people anymore. Right? Like sometimes Democrats will say, oh, we'll get Medicare for all, but we gotta go grassroots and convince more people. And I'm like, well, the polls say 88% of Democrats support Medicare for all. So how many people exactly do we have to convince? I think the people are with us. So it's not that I think that people don't see what's going on, but there is just this barrier that feels so overwhelming. And it feels like, will we even get to that tipping point again where we even have the protests like we had last summer when there are all of these release valves that seem to be coming up from the Biden administration? Oh, okay, first we appoint Kamala Harris. We invite the Floyd family to the White House and we do a nice photo op. there are some of these superficial things that keep coming down the pike, which seem to just be just enough to keep legitimate frustrations at bay. And at what point is it the responsibility of the few of folks who are arguably do have a little bit of platform and access to take a more adversarial approach to some of the people who are doing the sheep herding, the gatekeeping?
I mean, I think that's part of the kind of very courageous, critical work that you are doing. Du Bois had the same challenge with the hegemony of Booker T. Washington.
Good luck if it's on my Bad Faith podcast shoulders, because I don't know if we're up to all of that. And also, I will say personally, it has made me uncomfortable during the course of my career in journalism to constantly be fighting with other Black journalists. I don't like the taste that it leaves in my mouth, but there they are. In the way.
It's true. And you know what my attitude has always been, it would be very much what Art Tatum's attitude would be when he looked at other pianists, the Oscar Petersons and Mary Lou Williams and others. He said, look, I'm looking at this to the lens of my own tradition what has shaped me. And so anytime I'm critical, let's say, of an Obama, it is in the name of Martin Luther King Jr. It's in the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, you see, so that any fighting with other Black folk is in the name of Black poor people we love and poor people in general who we love. You see, I'm fighting for my grandmama. Now, will grandmama have the same status as some neoliberal Black sister? No, but I will love that Black sister, but no. And what would grandmama say? Be true to yourself. Focus on the least of these and be willing to bear a burden and take a risk and cut against the grain. And cutting against that grain includes cutting against the Black grain and the white grain. But keep in mind that it's big money and big military that's behind this. It's the allegiance to corporate elite and the allegiance to imperial policies. That's what's behind Clyburn when he says, I don't know nothing about foreign policy. We know the brother's lying. He's been voting all these years. He's afraid of being targeted by certain elements of the corporate power elite and the imperial power elite. And we understand that he's a politician, but he's got to be honest about it. We got to call him out on it.
Yeah, the nicest thing I'll say about Clyburn and even about other Black journalists is that I never want it to seem like I'm saying that the Black journalists are worse. I do think that there are, frankly, because of racial disparities, the pressures that everyone feels to keep your job and fall in line, especially elected officials who have to do so much fundraising and who don't have the same resources and support as white officials. I think the pressures to become corrupted, to take corporate money, to toe the line in these institutions is higher because there's farther to fall and more to lose. That's not an excuse, but it's a reason for us to keep our eyes open and be even more keen on holding our own communities accountable and to be more supportive of independent news efforts like what Mark is doing over at BNC and independent podcasts and news sources and magazines like Essence, where they just hired a friend of the show, Malaika Jabali, to be I think editor-in-chief, and she's a leftist, and I'm very excited to see what happens with that magazine. So,
and that's a beautiful thing. I mean, today is African Liberation Day. Founded in 1972 with the great Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and many, many others. And I was very close to Stokely in terms of our work together. I was very critical of him in terms of a whole host of other things. But I loved that brother on a very deep level. And what did he always say? Brother West, keep your eye on the imperialists, the neocolonialists, the capitalists, and the white supremacists. They didn't have male supremacists and homophobes as I do. But any authoritarian, and that includes even institutional religionists, and I say that as a Christian, those in the mosques and in the churches and in the synagogues who are accommodated to empire and capitalism and so forth. And so when that becomes the lens through which you view the world, you see, this is why Glenn Ford's and others, the Black Agenda Report, Jamu Baraka and the others, I stay in contact with what they're doing. I may not agree all the time, but they got the lens right. in terms of the focus on the least of these, those for known called the wretched of the earth. And once you have that tradition in place, that's what allows, you see, the Sarah Vaughns to say, that Nancy Wilson sounded good. She don't sound like me, but I know she's true to herself. She don't have nothing fake and phony in her sound. That's what we got to say to Black intellectuals and Black journalists. Are you posing? Are you posturing? Are you driven by interest? Are you driven by the carrots? Or are you for real? Because if you for real, then that's a different thing. I just had a dialogue with Glenn Lowry. Now, Glenn Lowry's been conservative ever since I've known that brother. Ain't no doubt about it. But he's not a fake. He's not a phony. You see, so you can engage folk who's not faking and phony, and posing and posturing. Our Black professional managerial class, Adolph Reed taught us this many years ago, they specialize in faking and faking the funk and posing like they're more radical than they are and acting like they're in solidarity with the poor, but they'll sell out the poor in a minute for the next corporate gift. Well, that needs to be called out. That doesn't mean we hate them, because if they're treated in a racist way, we're in solidarity with them. See, the minute Coates and Cobb and the others are treated in a vicious white supremacist way, even if they don't like me, I'm in solidarity with them.
Yeah, I find myself defending Nikole Hannah-Jones. I actually got in a fight with my mother over Mother's Day because I was defending Nikole Hannah-Jones, and you would think, if you know anything about our Twitter exchanges, I'm the last person on earth.
That's right. That's right. But see, that's what integrity is, my dear sister Briahna. That's what it is, and that's why I put my name on the petition. I would do it again. Of course, she's been on our show. We had wonderful dialogues together. And I do have respect for her in terms of cutting against the grain of a white supremacist hegemony. It's just that the way she cuts against it doesn't have the class and imperial dimensions that I think it ought to have. That's all.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. West. You're talking about who has kind of credibility and who's fake and who's authentic. I wonder what you make of this most recent vote to give an additional $1.9 billion of funding to the Capitol Police. And it kind of split across the squad. There was no squad solidarity on this one. It passed by one vote. If any of the people who voted present had voted no, it would not have passed. And Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush, and Jamal Bowman, is that right, Virgil, voted no.
I believe so, yeah.
No, it wasn't Jamal Bowman. It was Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush.
Might have been.
Maybe Rashida Tlaib. I think it was. Is there another black woman? I feel like it was three. Oh, it was Ayanna Pressley.
Oh, yeah. It was Pressley.
It was three black women. It was three black women. They all voted no, and everyone else voted present. All the other progressives that we would care about voted present. And what do you make of that in contrast with the narrative around defunding the police and doing dramatic criminal justice reform that each of these figures has engaged with over the course of their careers?
Yeah, I mean, I would just tell them there's an inconsistency there. We tell them we have disagreements based on principle. We might agree on some other things, but they have to be made accountable. And we ask them what their counter arguments are. I want to hear what the counter arguments are. What goes into you moving in this direction as opposed to a more progressive direction, given the suffering that's taken place across the board with these police who are out of control. I mean, so that's the kind of both dialogue and political pressure that needs to follow therefrom, it seems to me. And,
well, I hope you have access to them and can get in there and ask them a couple questions, Professor West, because
it would be wonderful. I have very little access with the politics. I can get in contact with Brother Bernie before I get in contact with almost anybody.
I believe that.
Brother Bernie and I don't agree on many things, but we agree on most things.
Well, what do you make of Bernie Sanders' recent statements? What was it, Virgil? That he was like, we need to tone down the language.
Tone down the rhetoric, yeah, I believe when asked. It might have been with referring to what's going on in Israel's genocide. I think that was the specific term that he objected to.
There are a number of liberals who use the word apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Do you think those who share your view should not use that kind of language?
Well, I think we should tone down the rhetoric. I think our goal is very simple. It is to understand that what's going on in Gaza today is unsustainable. When you have 70% of the young people unemployed, when people cannot leave the community, when hospitals and wastewater plants have been destroyed, that is unsustainable. And the job of the United States is to bring people together.
No, but I can understand that, though. I think that, when you're committing crimes against humanity, when you're committing war crimes, which I think Israel actually and undeniably is, that language is strong enough. I think genocide is a language that goes even beyond that. And you can have a debate about it, but it sends off various kind of signs and signals that take the focus away from the crimes against humanity to people you would think we can agree on. And so I think that probably that's what he had in mind. I don't know exactly what the context is, though.
It does actually feel like we've moved on from actually discussing crimes against humanity to effectively rhetoric policing. It feels like we're in this sort of state of reaction. And what I'm very curious is, as someone who's been an activist on Palestine for over 4 decades, do you believe that there, in the past month, do you detect any sort of shift in people's attitudes towards the issue? Because as we know, public opinion on a national scale in the United States is firmly in defense of Israel. But there also seems like there's been something of a shift in the left wing in the way that, we can talk about this issue. That's not just saying, oh, it's complicated and, there's 2 sides to every story.
Right. Oh, no, I think there's certainly been a shift. I mean, we see it in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement that many years ago, you were way out on the fringe. More and more people begin to see this is the last nonviolent effort to make sure that Palestinian humanity is affirmed. We're not calling for armed struggle. This is the last nonviolent option. This is why Tutu was supported, why Mandela and the others supported. And we're seeing a major increase. You can see the degree to which the Israeli elites, especially the right-wing ones, are targeting us. They're targeting BDS. But actually, that's a compliment. That shows, in fact, that our pressure is having some kind of impact in terms of international opinion. And international opinion is one of the last sources of hope for our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are being bombarded and targeted in this viciously inhumane way. But I mentioned before, among the younger generation, especially young Jewish brothers and sisters, if not now, and a host of others have been very important in this regard. And I think it's also taking place among, as was mentioned, in the Democratic Party. You remember when we were members of the Platform Committee 2016 fighting for this? We had the chance of a snowball in hell. They came at us tooth and nail. Now we've got voices inside of Congress explicitly bringing these issues to bear. But keep in mind, though, I think the general strike that was called for by Palestinian workers needs to be accented here. And this is why, again, the issue of genocide is a difficult one. It's the same way Black folk in America. You see, that our labor was so deeply needed to constitute the economic foundations of the nation. They were not going to engage in genocide against us in the way they did against indigenous peoples. And when you have a Palestinian working class that is so integral to the Israeli economy and say, well, Israel's committing genocide against Palestinians when the Palestinian labor is a precondition for the very preservation of the nation, then genocide language is not the right language in terms of the nature of the war crimes, the nature of the crimes against humanity. We can talk about the enslavement of Black people, Jim and Jane Crow Black people as extremities in terms of crimes against humanity, but it was not genocide against us in this massive way as with indigenous peoples or Armenians or Jews in Europe and what have you. Now, it's true that, I just had a wonderful senior thesis written by Muhammad Ali's grandson, Brother Jacob, brilliant brother. He gave an analysis of We Charge Genocide, William Patterson and others in 1951, and made a strong case of their attempt to use that kind of language. And so that's part of the debate, using the different kinds of language in terms of keeping track of the crimes against humanity. But I do think that the issues of Palestinian workers and workers going on strike, constituting major threats to the Israeli status quo. See, that shows the degree to which their labor is indispensable. And the Israeli ruling class understands that in the same way the slaveholders understood that my great-great-great-grandparents' labor was indispensable. They didn't want to engage in a genocide against them. They wanted to preserve their slave status in order to reproduce their barbaric white supremacist slavocratic society.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for that kind of measured and historically centered response, Dr. West. It's why it's always such a privilege to have you on and have you around and have you at great institutions like the one you're going to. And I'm sorry we never overlapped at Harvard, but they were always playing games. We have never there at the same time.
Best of the Harvard tradition, and they are some high quality folk in that Harvard tradition.
There are a couple of okay folks in the mix.
That's how I feel about it too.
You say what, Brother Virgil?
I said that's how I feel about it too.
Absolutely. Oh, indeed.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We've kept you for an hour. Do you want to tell people where they can find your podcast or any of your other work or writings?
Well, just, Tightrope Podcast with my dear sister Tricia Rose. We're on, and we've had Sister Briahna. We had wonderful time, one or two times, actually. We had great moments together. But most importantly, as I allude to continue, we've got to be committed to our integrity and truth-telling and consistency that keeps focus on the concrete suffering of fellow human beings, no matter who they are. We've got to have a universalism in our vision that is rooted in the specificity of different analyses of structures of domination and that wonderful tradition of resilience and resistance. We always have an overflow of struggle that is not reduced to simply what the powers that be want to reduce us to, which is either accommodators to a status quo or giving up, becoming so pessimistic it becomes cowardly, or acting as if we so progressive when in the end we just very cowardly when it comes to being tested for the truth telling and the witness bearing. And I salute both of you all, Sister Briahna and Brother Virgil and Brother Ben too.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. West. We really do appreciate your time always. And do take care of yourself.
Indeed. You all stay strong now.